serious concerns about Joe Biden's cognitive health during his presidency, but you never would have known listening to his family and top aides.
The behind-the-scenes details of how President Biden's closest aides privately discussed putting him into a wheelchair.
Joe Biden totally effed us. That quote from a top Kamala Harris official as we learn damning new details about the lengths that the White House went to allegedly cover up his declining health.
Original Sin. It's the blockbuster new expose of the Biden White House that's set to be released on Tuesday of next week, written by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson, and it's created a lot of buzz in the political media world. I'm Mediaite founding editor Colby Hall, and with me is editor-in-chief Aidan McLaughlin. Aidan, how are you?
I'm good, Colby. How you doing?
I'm great. This has been a big, buzzworthy sort of set of leaks and scoops that have come of this book before it's even been released.
I got it right here.
Oh, you got a copy. Wow,
got a copy.
Mine's in the mail. Good for you.
Yep.
What's your take so far? It's got a lot of coverage, and we'll get into the coverage because the coverage itself is fascinating to sort of parse and look through. But what's your take so far?
So I have a maddeningly nuanced view of this that I think will satisfy no one, which is that, a lot of the criticism has centered on the media. Obviously, the premise of this book is that Biden had declined and that it was not a shock to people within the administration, and that as a result, there must have been a cover-up. And there is a question about how complicit the media was in this cover-up. I'm just a little bit skeptical of that premise to begin with. As you know, Colby, pushed us to cover Biden's decline for the last couple of years. I think it was, and I think a lot of conservative critics of Biden agree with this and point this out now and at the time. It was obvious to anyone with eyes that Biden had declined significantly. To me, it was
especially in the last year and a half, 2 years of his time in office.
Exactly. And to me, it was obvious that he, one, should certainly not run for president again, could not have handled 4 more years in office, and probably that he shouldn't have been president at the time in that last year.
Yeah.
That was glaringly obvious to me, and that's why I'm a little bit skeptical of this idea that there was a cover-up that the media could have possibly been complicit in, because if it's so obvious, what is there to cover up? We all saw, the White House kept very tight controls on his appearances, as you've noted in your columns. They avoided doing a Super Bowl interview, which is like the easiest interview that a president could possibly do.
Right.
And the media called out the Biden administration for the fact that he wasn't doing many public appearances. He wasn't really taking questions from the press. He wasn't doing these big interviews that presidents typically subject themselves to. And to me, that was all evidence that he had declined to a point where they had to carefully manage and choreograph his public appearances. The idea that there was a cover-up as a result, to me, isn't that compelling. And I think that to a lot of the public, it was very obvious that this was happening. I think what a lot of people in the media did, and certainly what the Biden administration and officials did, was they looked at this and said, yes, he's lost a step, he's declined, it's not great, but we want to beat Donald Trump. We see Donald Trump as a bigger threat. And they saw Joe Biden as the one person who had beaten Trump in his political career. And they thought if we could just, forgive the crass term, but if we could just drag him over the line, that would be a better outcome. And you can make an argument in favor of that. I think it's probably the wrong argument. Biden should have dropped out in January. They should have allowed for a nice primary or a short primary.
Or just decided he was never going to run for a second term and just focus on his legacy. And,
as he suggested he would.
Yeah. He was always meant to right the ship. And I think that would have made a lot of sense. But I think, people in power want to stay in power, and you sort of get used to that. We haven't yet seen evidence of the cover-up. And it's worth noting that the title of the book, Original Sin, isn't really about the cover-up or even the media coverage. It's about Biden's decision to run for re-election. And he was a guy that was saying that Ultra MAGA and Donald Trump was a threat to democracy. And the irony is that his decision to stay in the race as long as he did basically ensured Trump was going to get reelected, right? And it's more complicated and there's way more nuance, but the original sin is on Biden, not necessarily his aides or even the media coverage.
And also, I should just note, when it comes to the staff, first of all, I agree. The argument was that Trump was this once in a lifetime threat to democracy. And that the real strong argument is that by keeping Biden in, you're risking this unbelievable threat. And I think that's why Democrats, I'm a little bit confused as when Democrats blame the media for pointing out that Biden was too old. Because if you truly believe that Trump is the threat to democracy, Biden should have gotten out way earlier. And I think one of the reasons why he didn't is that the people that surrounded him, his chief of staff, his administration, his campaign, they all have jobs in a second Biden term.
Right.
They don't necessarily have jobs in a first Kamala Harris term. And
Right.
so there's a massive personal political incentive to keep your principle in the race. Yeah, it's self-preservation. You're not going to sacrifice your own job as
well. I mean,
White House
that's
chief of
not just
staff.
the Biden administration. I think that's administrations, going. But you're right. I think Biden had the opportunity to leave on his own terms and save his legacy, and he did not. One of the things I think that's missing here, and we'll get into the media coverage. It's true that conservative media were making fun of Biden as an old guy going back to 2020, and not unfairly. Like, he's got a history of being a gaffe machine.
Right.
But the recency effect here is that in 2024, he was very different, and than he was in 2020. And so I put together clips from every year from when he was, campaigning in 2020 all the way to 2025. Let's take a look real quickly at how Biden evolved over his time in office.
For all those of you who voted for President Trump, I understand the disappointment tonight. I've lost a couple times myself, but now let's give each other a chance. It's time to put away the harsh rhetoric, lower the temperature, see each other again, listen to each other again.
When I was sworn in on January 20th, less than 1% of the seniors in America were fully vaccinated against COVID-19. 100 days later, 70% of seniors in America over 65 are protected, fully protected.
I stand here tonight having served as long as about any one of you have ever served here. But I've never been more optimistic about our future, about the future of America. We just have to remember who we are. For over 200 years, America has carried on the greatest experiment in self-government in the history of the world. And that's not hyperbole, that's a fact. Great thing about America is here. Kings and dictators do not rule, the people do. History is in your hands. The power is in your hands. The idea of America lies in your hands. The projects, the benefits. How do you lead the world without having the best infrastructure in the world? How do you lead the world without having the best healthcare in the world? How do you lead the world without having the best education system in the world? How do you lead the world when you don't have that done?
I mean, I think it's pretty clear that, being in the White House under that scrutiny, it ages you.
Yep.
But,
look at Obama's hair.
Well, but when he was being criticized for being sort of decrepit and sort of cognitively not, in 2020, 2021, it didn't really resonate because he was old, but he still had his wits together. And so you look at the last year and a half, you and I both wrote about, it's abundantly clear that he is in decline. Now, you could say that, are we conflating his age and the ravages of age with decline? I don't know. He had a hard time communicating. His appearance during the first and only debate that he did with Trump was disastrous. He couldn't complete a thought, and it wasn't just because he was sick. And it was at that point that everyone realized, oh, we haven't really seen him for the last 6 months. And I think, therein lies the sort of the debate, and it's tough to parse. Was he always in decline in 2020, or was it just the last year and a half? To me, it was clear that it was the last year he really fell off a cliff in terms of his ability to speak.
Yeah, and I think that's why this subject and this story in particular defies the sort of simplistic partisan arguments that are dominating the debate right now.
Right.
The people on the right who are attacking Jake Tapper for not being aggressive enough in covering Biden's decline. And I think it's probably true, and Jake Tapper admits it himself, that he was not aggressive enough. Alex Thompson, his co-author, I thought was, and did a lot of really, really great work for Axios, challenging the Biden campaign and the administration. But none of this was black and white. There was not a moment where it was, so obvious to everyone until we got to the debate that Biden could not possibly be supported. And I mean, you can make the argument on the right, and Democrats do all the time, that Trump is too cognitively impaired to be president. Now, I don't think that Trump has had a real slip. Democrats for years have been saying, oh, Trump's like really losing it now. To me, Trump hasn't declined at all in the last 10 years.
Well,
he's just always been a little crazy.
Look,
and so
I wrote the column saying that, he's not declined in the way that we would define it with Biden.
Yeah.
But some of the stuff that he says, like I wrote a column about the 51st state with Canada. Like he said that so often that it seems like he believes it himself, and it sort of belies any logic. Like, all right, so if you really think they should become a 51st state, what does that look like? And there's no practical answer. And of course, it was dismissed early as just being a troll. But when he says it so often, you're like, okay, what? And so it's not decline in that he doesn't. He's in such a bubble of sycophancy that no one's saying, like, dude, stop with the Canada being a 51st state. That's not really viable unless you really want to invade them. Right. Is that what we're talking about here?
Trump's been, I think there's no question that Trump's administration in his second term is way more unbridled and unrestrained than it was in his first term. But Trump's been shooting himself in the foot with dumb policy since term one.
Right.
I mean, case in point is when he first got into office, the first thing he did when he got into office was he passed the travel ban, which shut down immigration from a bunch of countries. And it created a catastrophe at the airports. I was working for the New York Daily News at the time, and I got dispatched to JFK. And it was a total mess at the airports of people, NYU doctoral students coming from Iran who suddenly were being turned away at the airport because Iran was now on a list of banned countries. And that was a mess. It got challenged in the courts, and it was a massive failure for the Trump administration in the first month.
That wasn't cognitive decline. That was just an extremist position.
Extremist position, and also just not very smart.
Not thought through.
And he's doing that in this term as well. He started, regardless of whether you think of the merits of tariff policy, I think most political operatives would say it's probably not a good idea to start with an explosive inflationary policy the moment you get into office when you've been elected to bring down prices instead of passing a tax cut.
Right.
Why not start with the tax cut? And your approval rating soars up to 60%.
You could argue that Liberation Day was not thought through, and also also a reflection of not necessarily cognitive decline, but just really, really poor judgment, which is a separate thing altogether.
Right.
Let's go back to the Tapper book, though, because it has gotten a ton of attention, but really, your take on the book thus far, which is kind of got a ton of news coverage, really depends upon what network you're watching, right? And I wrote a column exploring this about like how, what they covered sort of reveal their own agenda. And what I found that really interesting and really revealing is that MSNBC has almost completely ignored this story. And I think there's a really clear reason, best evidenced by Joe Scarborough and what his take was on Joe Biden in 2024. Let's watch this clip real quick.
Start your tape right now, because I'm about to tell you the truth. And F you if you can't handle the truth. He's far beyond cogent. In fact, I think he's better than he's ever been. Intellectually, analytically, this version of Biden, intellectually, analytically, is the best Biden ever. Not a close second, and I've known him for years.
Does it surprise you that MSNBC is just completely ignoring this story? I mean, the book comes out next week. They could change, but it seems like an admission that they were wrong. They don't want to admit that they were wrong by giving any airtime to a story that seems to assert or prove or report on Biden was not as sharp as, say, Joe Scarborough just said that he was.
Right. Well, I think there's a couple things at play here. There's one, the obvious that MSNBC doesn't want to reckon with its role in arguing that Biden was fit enough to run for president again. And that is the core premise of this book. Now, I think if you asked any MSNBC host now, they'd tell you Biden shouldn't have run again.
Right.
He should have dropped out earlier, and we should have had
hindsight's 2020,
a stronger candidate. But the fact remains that at the time when MSNBC hosts thought that they were stuck with Biden,
right,
before the debate and probably in the weeks afterwards, they dutifully argued that Biden was fine and that Biden should be elected over Donald Trump. Now, again, you can argue if you believe that, and I think this is the honest argument that you can make if you believe that even in cognitive decline, Biden is a preferable president to Donald Trump. But that's a hard argument to make when you're trying to convince Americans to vote for a guy that you're accepting is in cognitive decline. So I think that's the position that MSNBC hosts are in. The second thing, and I think this is probably a stronger incentive for MSNBC to not go all in on covering this book, is that in the wake of the 2024 election, MSNBC saw a massive exodus of its audience.
Right.
Just liberals did not want to watch the news. Trump.
Well, they just turned on. It's like, if your favorite team is losing in a rout, you don't want to watch the post game. You just I'm going to go for a walk and
after years of hearing how horrible Trump was, how he could never be elected president again, how the country would never make that same mistake again, to see him elected with the 77 million votes that he was elected with, and for months they tuned it out, and MSNBC is only just in the last couple of months starting to regain that audience as people start to tune back in and tune back into the administration and MSNBC's coverage of it. And so that's a really precarious position that the network is in. And
Right.
the last thing that audience wants to see is a relitigation of the 2024 election and criticism of the way Democrats went into it. And
that no one wants to look in the rearview mirror. No one wants to relitigate why they lost. But you said something previously that I think was really interesting, is that the term dutifully argued. It's what MSNBC did. And I think that's exactly right. But to what duty were they arguing, right? Was there, and I think this is one of the real criticisms that MSNBC has kind of gotten a pass on, is it seemed like their duty was not for the betterment of the American public, but was for the agenda of the DNC. And that's not news. I mean, they've had a lot of DNC guests and they clearly lean left, and it's pretty much out in the open that that's their point of view, and they don't hide from it. But if the goal and the mission is to sort of warn that Trump is going to end America, and you are, the whole Biden sort of value proposition was that he was going to stop Trump, it's kind of where the Democrats have painted themselves into the corner right now, because all they're offering right now is sort of, resist Trump instead of putting forth their own sort of argument of this is what we can do. Now, the ship had long left the shores, right? The train had left the station. You can't really change that. But I do think that, we live in an age where it's so rare that people own up to their mistakes on air and say yeah, we got this wrong. And, Rachel Maddow, Joy Reid, who's no longer with the network, Lawrence O'Donnell, there's a lot in, obviously, the Morning Joe crew, especially Joe and Mika, they were really huge supporters or defenders of Biden against this. And I think that's obvious why they don't want to cover it. But at some point, I would love to see Jake Tapper on the Morning Joe. I don't think that will ever happen, but I think that would be one of the more fascinating conversations. I could imagine Alex Thompson being on set, even though he's a CNN contributor, part of a book promo. But, it does seem like MSNBC is still sort of trying to wash the stink off of them. And this book sort of is a reminder. So I guess it makes sense, but I think this is an opportunity for them to have a mea culpa, and they're going to opt not to do it.
And, the generous view is that elections are binary, and that these MSNBC hosts could argue that even, as I noted, even if Biden were in decline, he's still preferable to a Donald Trump presidency. But that is the argument for why they backed Biden in the past. The problem now is that unless you reckon with the mistakes that were made in the last election, you're doomed to repeat them. And so the Democrats need to, and left-leaning media needs to understand why they lost this last election. And burying your head in the sand and pretending that Biden was a formidable candidate who had no problems and they made no mistakes in the last election is not the way to do that.
Right. And, Democrats need to figure out what their plan is. Like, what is it that they're selling? They've lost the populism. They've lost a lot of the working class sort of appeal.
I spoke
and
to
just sloganeering from Trump, but like, it's not enough to say you're not Trump.
Right. I spoke to Paul Begala, the Democratic strategist, for a piece I wrote a couple of weeks ago, and he said that Democrats, for the first time, lost voters making under $50,000 a year.
It's crazy,
and that is a catastrophe for the Democratic Party.
Well, when I was growing up, the Republican Party was the party of businessmen and country club people. And if you look at the 2024 Republican convention, it was Hulk Hogan and Dana White and Kid Rock. It was, in marketing parlance, it was like C&D counties. It was like rural, small, trailer that was the swing vote, as it turns out. I want to pivot now to the 800-pound gorilla in terms of the media coverage, Fox News, which I think it's worth noting when we talk about this. People may not know this, but 2 out of every 3 cable news viewers tunes into Fox News. And Fox News is remarkably disciplined about their messaging, right? They don't mention Biden without sort of a dig. They don't really talk about Trump unless it's sort of elevating him. And to talk about this is like MSNBC and Fox News are even, it's not even a fair fight. Fox News. And so Fox News coverage of this has been pretty stunning because, of course, they're gloating. They're pounding their chest like, aha, we've been talking about Sleepy Joe forever. The truth is that they haven't really reported on any of Biden's decline. They just looked at video clips of him and sort of pointed at, laughed and insulted him as like sippy cup or applesauce head. That's not reporting. It's just, it's just mocking him. And as it turns out, they were more right than wrong. I think they were sort of prematurely right. Blaming him for cognitive decline in 2020 didn't really resonate. So that when it actually did was obvious, they kind of painted themselves as just partisan hacks attacking him, and it didn't resonate. That's a tough criticism of them because truthfully, again, they were more right than wrong. But Fox News is like sort of really, and they've gone way out of their way to just totally crap all over Tapper for a ton of reasons. What's your take on Fox News coverage?
Well, I think the point you made is a good one about the way they covered this. There's a little bit of a boy who cried wolf scenario with Fox where, you're right, like they will be accusing Biden of cognitive decline, from the moment that he misstates a word. And so when it comes to him actually having problems, I think they're taken a little bit less seriously. That said, they were correct, but you're right. Fox News wasn't doing any reporting on this. If there was a cover up, where was the Fox News reporting on covering what Biden was like behind the scenes?
Right.
And that's because, Fox News does have White House reporters and they do a decent job.
And Peter Doocy actually did a great job of asking the toughest questions.
Asking questions. Yeah. And, I'm sure it's very hard to, as a Fox News reporter, to get sources inside a Democratic White House.
Right.
That is not easy, and I'm not going to pretend that it is. But you're right. With Fox, it's often a case of it's mostly commentary.
Right.
Fox News doesn't have the newsroom that the New York Times has, or that the Wall Street Journal has, or that CNN has. And so most of their coverage is going to be punditry, which, as we know from covering the cable news space, is cheaper and results in better ratings. When you can rely on the reporting of places like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and then just talk about it. That's a better, more lucrative way to do news than if you actually have to invest in the reporting yourself.
Well, let me just say real quickly that in their defense, nobody else did this reporting until after the election, right?
Well, there were a couple places. The Wall Street Journal had a great piece that got an enormous amount of criticism at the time from...
That was April 2024, right?
April 2024, they reported that Biden shows signs of slipping. And I remember at the time, Democrats were really got their panties in a twist about this story and said, it only quotes Republicans on the record. That was their criticism of it. Of course,
well, I wrote that piece and I said that it undermined the sort of value that the only sources that were quoted on the record were secondhand comments from Mike Johnson, Kevin McCarthy, and all of the sort of inside the White House of Democratic leadership. Anyone that was on record was defending Biden. Everything else was.
But no Democrats are going to go on the record and say that Biden's lost his mind.
No, but I do think the fact that the way that it was sourced did raise some questions. It would have been. I mean, turned out to be totally accurate, but the sourcing did raise questions. I think there were, and honestly, anyone that could see Biden beforehand knew that it was more likely to be true than not.
Right.
But one other thing I want to say about Fox News is one thing they've turned to, apart from just pounding their chest saying we knew this was right and mocking Jake Tapper, they seem to be going out of their way mocking the idea of selling books. I put together some clips that sort of make that point.
Jake Tapper, who ignored this story virtually his entire tenure from the time he ran in 2020 through the end, wants to make money off it now.
And now make money off of books.
Look at all these things that were happening that we never wanted to talk about until we could make money on books.
Yeah, now people are making money off books.
Now, they really love to smear Jake Tapper. And, they even say that he was leader of the cover-up. But, you said this earlier, Alex Thompson kind of made his name in 2024. Like, he was kind of the big star to emerge from the last campaign. Got this book deal, got a contributorship with CNN because he was the rare person that was not playing partisan. Like he was getting to the bottom of things, and people thought he was anti-Biden when he appeared on CNN and MSNBC, but he was just calling facts. I think on CNN, Tapper actually was pretty tough on Biden, or at least, insiders in the Biden White House loathed Jake Tapper because he was kind of tough on them.
Yeah. I mean, first off, it's just hilarious to see Fox News complain about another
book promotion.
Fox News literally has its own book imprint.
They sell books more effectively than any other.
Oh, they're amazing.
They're shameless about it.
One appearance on Fox and Friends, your book will be on the New York Times bestseller list. They're very good at it, and almost every single person on Fox News that is on air has a book.
Joe Concha is the #1 bestseller on New York Times, which speaks volumes.
But putting that aside, I think one thing that we have lost in this sort of like hyper-partisan media climate that we find ourselves in is that the president of the United States is not a wounded puppy. They are the single most powerful person on the planet. They are responsible for decisions that are life and death. They can start wars with congressional approval, hopefully. They can fund wars. They can kill people. They can, in Trump's case, disappear you to a Venezuelan gulag. They are enormously powerful, and they should be asked extraordinarily tough questions.
Right.
The free press should treat presidents with utter suspicion and contempt.
Right.
And so whenever I see anyone complaining about the way a president is treated, whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president, my eyes roll out of my head because they should be spared they should be given very little breathing room to their scrutiny should be dialed up to 11.
The role is to speak truth to power, not to.
And so you have a president in Biden who was very clearly in serious cognitive decline. The idea that an anchor like Jake Tapper, who again I think could have been more aggressive in covering him, that the White House didn't like him and that, Democrats were upset by his coverage and now Fox News is sort of, mocking him, which is ridiculous. The idea that he should have gone less hard is ridiculous. He should have been more aggressive. And I'm glad that he's written this book now. I don't think it's too little too late because I do think that it's one of the better views of what happened in the 2024 election and better explainers of why Trump ended up winning.
The book publishers put together a montage of moments where Tapper actually was pretty tough on Biden himself and his aides about. Here's just portions of that clip so you can see.
Will you pledge that if you're elected, you will be transparent about your health, all facets of your health, with urgency so that we know?
Yes.
One poll shows that almost 2/3 of Democratic voters want a new nominee in 2024, and the top reason they gave was your age. That's not a good number for President Biden. 2/3 of the American people say he's not sharp enough to be president. Okay, so you're part of the 23% of adults who are not concerned about the president's ability to be president because of his age and stamina. I mean, I know incumbents in general are not popular right now, but do you ever think maybe we should have a new candidate? this is a particularly bad week for this report and its comments about President Biden's faculties and his memory to come out, because twice this week he has acted as if he, in 2021, spoke to European leaders who have been dead for years. Part of the job of president is having the confidence of the American people in your faculties.
You know, I think he did that to he knew that he was going to get attacked. And it is stunning how committed Fox News is to just smearing Tapper. And I think part of it is territorial, because I think Tapper has really positioned himself as a moderate, as a centrist. And part of being a centrist is you're willing to call out the bullshit on the left, which he sees here. And I don't think that Fox News really wants to cede that territory. They really do well when they paint MSNBC, obviously, but even CNN as this left-leaning network. And I think CNN is trying really hard to come back to the middle. And you could argue even that Tapper is kind of going center-right to sort of course correct. I don't think that that's true. But I see this as almost a territorial war where Fox News is telling Tapper, like, it doesn't serve their business interest to allow Tapper to give them place to be critical of that. And I will also say Tapper said in a pretty stunning moment on CNN this morning, he was interviewed for the TV show CNN This Morning by John Berman about his past coverage, in which he was a pretty open mea culpa, which you'll see right here.
What do you think of conservatives now criticizing you and the media in general for how President Biden was covered during his administration?
I think some of the criticism is fair, to be honest, of me. Certainly, I'm not going to speak for anybody else. But knowing then what I know now, I look back at my coverage during the Biden years, and I did cover some of these issues, but not enough. I look back on it with humility.
So that's rare. You rarely see any TV personality say with humility that I could have done better. And he got mocked for that. But I think that's something that we should celebrate.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think whenever a journalist admits that they have made a mistake on something, that's good. And I think you're definitely right that it's a business play for Fox to try and undermine Jake Tapper, because the sort of caricature of CNN on Fox is that it's this obsessive, frothing anti-Trump network that stops at nothing to promote Democrats. And when you have a book that is, calling out and is packed full of reporting that sheds the last Democratic president in a negative light from a CNN anchor, that obviously punctures that caricature. And at the end of the day, I'm sure there's a little bit of jealousy there. Fox News should have really written this book.
Well, it's true. And I will say, with this sort of one of the most revealing moments, I think, after on Fox and Friends, they aired that clip of Jake Tapper very humbly admitting that he could have done better. And how did they react? Ainsley Earhart, who really loves to wrap herself in the American flag, but also talks about her Christian values a lot, she had this to say. Now, that shows zero grace. And I think that's really revealing. Like, just zero grace towards a guy that basically said, you could say that it's cynical that he did that, maybe. But I don't know. I think it would be great if more people did that. The last thing I want to say real quickly is, what do you make of the criticism that Tapper and Thompson, if they had all these newsy scoops, they should have just reported them? Is there reason to be critical of them by holding these for...
So basically admitting that he didn't cover it the way he should have, and now he wants to make money on it.
Book publishing?
Yeah,
I think I know your answer on this, but what's your take?
Of all of the criticisms that you could level about this book or any other book, and this criticism comes up a lot, I think it's the silliest one. So the argument is that Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson should have reported the stuff that they got in this book before, when it mattered. First of all, they started reporting the contents of this book after the election.
Right.
So there was no reporting at the time. Second of all, the idea that that these two reporters who have proven themselves willing to challenge the Biden administration on his age would have sat on any of the explosive scoops found in this book. I saw some people fixating on the George Clooney reporting where George Clooney said that Biden didn't recognize him at a fundraiser. Obviously, Alex Thompson would have reported that for Axios had he known it at the time.
Right.
It's a really good scoop. And let's be honest, reporters are ambitious.
the idea that they would hold that to later cash in is bizarre.
It's a bit of a fantasy that reporters care more about partisan allegiance than their own ambitions.
Well, I think it also reveals that people are just grasping for straws, and one of the big criticisms. One of the big criticisms in publishing is that books are never fact checked. And this book, they hired famous fact checkers from the New Yorker to make sure that there weren't errors, which is really rare and I think really smart of them, and probably cost them a pretty penny. But at the end of the day, like, is well worth it to just sort of save any future controversy or
and you know that this is a book that's going to get an enormous amount of scrutiny. So you better hope that there is not a single error in there. And then just one more thing on the reporting process. A lot of this reporting is not stuff that you could have even gotten during the Biden administration, because sources are not going to speak out, particularly sources within the Biden administration, and tell these stories when they're still worried about winning an election. So after the election, when all these people have gone off to work for lobbying firms and for cable news networks, now they're going to be a lot more open to spilling on the details of what went on behind the scenes. But it's a lot harder to get that when the election is still pending. So I think that, the criticism that they should have reported this earlier is just totally nonsense.
Well, it's easier to aggregate than report. And I think that's kind of like exposes the folly of Fox News criticism, because Fox News has really become an aggregator, less a reporter. But no one really was reporting on this at the time because it was, the White House had sort of circled the wagons. Aidan, this has been good stuff. This is a good rehearsal. We should record this now.
Thanks, Colby. This was fun.
Hey, quick button here. Please click the like and subscribe button for more videos like this. I'm Mediaite founding editor Colby Hall. You are
Mediaite editor-in-chief Aidan McLaughlin.
Thanks for watching the video. See you around.